Howdy do. This is Professor Byrne, and this is my one-take video for Adaptation. I know it's been a while since I did one of these videos or posted it. All I can say is that these little videos, as short as they are, like any film, are productions and require some setup and preparation. And I haven't had a lot of time to do that lately. In fact, I've been traveling. You can tell from the mise en scène, the details in the frame, that I am not in my usual spot. I'm actually visiting my mom in North Carolina, and I'm in the study and doing these videos there. So I'm going to try to talk about adaptation. I may not have more than 5 minutes of material. It may be mostly babbling in ums and ahs, but I shall give it my best effort. You may have noticed, or you may have followed links, these videos that I'm posting on my YouTube channel, which is actually the English 329B video channel at YouTube. And if you do watch it, I think if you click on it, it'll take you to YouTube, and it'll include, as YouTube does, all of the various related videos. And some are more related than others. I found one video that was 25 animals with insane survival adaptations. And the video, it had a picture of snarling tigers. So it's what you would call clickbait, just something posted up there to catch your attention. Needless to say, it has very little to do with literary adaptations to film. There was also another random video, Family Guy, Democracy Kicks In. And it was about, I guess it was one of the Family Guy episodes during the Gulf War. So I have no idea where the connection is, except that it's probably the word adaptation was in there somewhere. Who knows? Who knows? Okay. All right. Sorry, my Kindle is... There we go. Acting up as it usually does. So, I guess the point I'm trying to make here is just the randomness of online video, and the fact that oftentimes what we watch is randomly connected to other things, and our surfing is often quite random, and that's the way we watch videos online. So it's certainly something to consider when you're talking about film and even film adaptations. Since I'm traveling, I didn't actually bring a whole stack of books. I brought some. So, but even so, I couldn't bring a copy of Orchid, my copy of Orchid Thief. I must have lent it to someone anyway. It's missing from my library, which gets me to doubt my particular organization strategy, which I discussed in another video, particularly since the Orchid Thief is creative nonfiction, a sort of in-between genre between fiction and say, journalism. So there wasn't really a place in my library for creative nonfiction, so who knows where I shelved it. But it wasn't in fiction, and it wasn't in my journalism section, so I'm not quite sure. But so it's an in-between genre, and that of course comes into play also when you're trying to adapt a literary work to film, in that there should be some consideration of the genre and some sort of translation to a similar genre in film. So I'm not... Well, I guess there would be a category in film that deals with creative nonfiction. And many documentaries now are very creative. They use fiction techniques of a feature film, fiction film, and use those for their documentaries. Michael Moore would be a good example of that, and Errol Morris as well, one of the best-known documentarians. I just wanted to mention a couple other works that are similar to The Orchid Thief. In my film essay, I talked about how the creative nonfiction was a relatively new genre. It became popular in the 90s. So at the same time that Susan Orlean was publishing The Orchid Thief, first as articles in the New Yorker and then as a book, there were a couple other creative nonfiction works that were huge bestsellers and were on the bestseller list for a very long time. And I'm talking, first of all, of the book, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil by John Behrens. It's, again, in the late 90s, it was on bestsellers for probably a couple years. It did get a film adaptation with Kevin Spacey, not one of his best performances, and not actually Clint Eastwood directed it, and not one of Clint Eastwood's best efforts either. It didn't do that well in the box office, but it's an interesting book, and it's a very good example of creative nonfiction. It's sort of a biography of a city, the city being Savannah, Georgia, and Behrens. Is the next book he did after that was a similar work, but set it in Venice, Italy. So he has a thing about writing biographies, or creative nonfiction biographies of cities. The other book I wanted to mention is Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt. Frank McCourt was, he was actually born in New York City. He spent his childhood in Ireland, came back to New York City, and was a public school teacher for decades. In all that time, he was tinkering with this memoir, which is a kind of creative nonfiction and also came to be very popular form of writing in the 1990s and into the 2000s. It's one of my favorite books, and it's the voice of McCourt in the work that makes it special. I just want to read you one of the sentences from it, if I can get it without messing things up too badly. Okay, all right. Hello. Okay. The text is not there. That's not what I wanted. Okay. Sorry about this. Yeah. I go online and I find the correct page, and then when I come back to it when I'm doing these videos, it's missing. So let's see. What I want to do is get the first sentence of the work. Okay. Here we go. Scroll. I know it's so much fun watching someone scroll online. And my Kindle's not cooperating. Okay. All right. I'll just read the first couple sentences. My father and mother should have stayed in New York, where they met and married and where I was born. Instead, they returned to Ireland when I was 4. My brother Malachi, 3. The twins, Oliver and Eugene, barely 1. And my sister Margaret, dead and gone. When I look back on my childhood, I wonder how I survived at all. It was, of course, a miserable childhood. The happy childhood is hardly worth your while. Worse than the ordinary miserable childhood is the miserable Irish childhood, and worse yet is the miserable Irish Catholic childhood. People everywhere brag and whimper about the woes of their early years, but nothing can compare with the Irish version. The poverty, the shiftless, loquacious, alcoholic father, the pious, defeated mother moaning by the fire, pompous priests, bullying schoolmasters, the English, and the terrible things they did to us for 800 long years. Above all, we were wet. And he goes on talking about growing up in Limerick and how wet, how much it rains there, and so on. Let me get back to my notes if I can. And I can't. All right. I'm just going to keep these glasses on rather than figuring out how to make the text bigger. Okay. So you get a little taste of McCord's voice in that. There's a lot of humor in the work, and there is a lot of poignancy, some very wonderful stories. And there was a film version of it shortly after the book came out, and it hit the bestseller list. And it's a faithful adaptation, but it does not capture that voice. And so it's just, instead of a lyrical presentation of a miserable Irish childhood, it just shows us a miserable Irish childhood. So it loses a lot in the translation. So let me go from that and start talking about adaptation. It's actually 11 minutes so far. Let's see if I can get this done in 4 minutes or so. So Adaptation was one of the first films, well, probably the first film I thought about, and really the film I built the course around in terms of literary adaptation, because it raises most, if not all, of the big questions or the big problems that adaptations present to us. And so I thought it was certainly appropriate. And again, it's not a faithful adaptation at all, but it raises problems that are interesting and are well worth looking into. All right. The film it's most like, I would say, in the course is Tristram Shandy. Both films, both Adaptation and Tristram Shandy, make a joke out of the idea of adapting a literary work to film. Make a joke about the impossibility of doing it, and they're impossible to film in different ways. So again, that's why both Tristram Shandy and Adaptation are on the syllabus. And I see from my notes I'm almost done here, so I guess I didn't have a lot to say about Adaptation. I do have a few things to say about Charlie Kaufman, the screenwriter for the film, and the screenwriter, of course, who sort of writes himself into the story. Charlie Kaufman is what I would call, well, other people call him this as well, an auteur. That's a French film term. Roughly, it translates as author, but usually, when we're talking about auteur theory in film, we're talking about writer-directors, and not as many now, but say back in the 50s and 60s, film directors like Jean-Luc Godard, Federico Fellini, Ingmar Bergman. These were all film directors that largely wrote what they were filming. So that is what made them auteur. The auteur theory comes to us from France, as much of our film theory does, particularly in a publication in the 50s and 60s called Cahiers de Cinema. And so that's really, though, a sort of a European conception, the auteur. In the writer-director is the auteur in European understanding. But in American film, the auteur was usually the producer. I'm talking about classical Hollywood and many of the films that are famous from Hollywood, probably say epitomized by Gone with the Wind from 1939. David O. Selznick was really the one who put that film together. And I'm not even sure who the director was. It wasn't really important. The director took orders from the producer. So two very different conceptions of the auteur. In some sense, in the 1970s, in the so-called American Renaissance in film, that model of the auteur, well, it became a staple in film schools, and people like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas and Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola were all very much influenced by auteur theory. So there's some melding between the two. And that's true of Kaufman in Adaptation. He was actually an executive producer of the film as well as the screenwriter. So in some sense, he's both the European and American sense of kind of auteur. And I'll just mention in closing that Charlie Kaufman, if you do a search online, he was supposed to, or at least he was attached to a project. He was supposed to write the screenplay for a new version of Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, and I was very excited about when I first heard about that in 2013, because Charlie Kaufman's one of my favorite screenwriters, and Kurt Vonnegut is one of my favorite authors. I will say though that there was a version in George Roy Hill, I think, directed in the early 70s. There was a previous version, a film version of Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, which is well regarded and is a classic in its own right. But to have Charlie Kaufman write the script for the adaptation and Guillermo del Toro was directing was very exciting to me. And so, and I'll just raise one more point before I stop in this rambling film, is that an issue that I haven't mentioned yet was the idea of the auteur and a script writer for an adaptation. You might sense that there's a conflict there, in that the writer, director, or screenwriter, as it often was, in his impulses and creative process would interfere with the impulses and creative process of the author of the literary work. And that explains why Kaufman wrote himself into the story, in terms of that he couldn't keep his creative authorship from impinging on the creative authorship of Susan Orlean. But the fact that he highlighted that interference into the creative process of the adaptation is a problem that is worth thinking about. In 17 minutes, I shall stop here.